We're here with Dr. Julia Meszaros.
I'm a sociologist. I am currently at East Texas A&M in Commerce, Texas, which is outside of Dallas and part of like the larger Texas A&M system. So,
Okay, great. I really appreciate your time. We're here to talk about some research that you've done, and you also have a new book out, and you've studied something very interesting, and that is the premium international dating scene. And this is an area that is interesting because it's one of those fields that I think a lot of people are curious about, but because there has been a stigma, are maybe afraid to talk about or afraid to, even if they're involved in it, maybe it's almost like a secret society, like, are you one too? Are you one too? Or something like that. And it's interesting, but you dived in, and which is something that's I won't say brave, like it's dangerous or anything like that. But at the beginning, I'm sure, and you've studied this for more than a decade, I'm sure that people had to kind of raise eyebrows, like, you're studying what? Or is this a serious study, or are you trying to get a discount, or what's happening here? So maybe, how did you become interested in this subject? And you spent more than a decade so far on it.
I read an article about it in a graduate class, and I was interested in comparing stuff happening in Eastern Europe to what's been going on in Latin America. So, like, you have an interest in Eastern Europe. Obviously, I have connections there. And so I was just kind of really interested to see kind of what motivates people to do intercultural relationships, because they can be often fraught with a lot of difficulties, and what encourages people to actively seek it out. I think it's one thing, right? Like you said, you move somewhere, you meet someone local, you're in an intercultural relationship, but typically, right, most people are not seeking that out. It's difficult, right, to do long distance, to do all this visa stuff, who's going to go where, do you speak the same language, all of these barriers, right? So I was just, interested, because as we're like in a time of globalization in general, it makes sense that people would be kind of expanding their search, right, for love. I started in this industry, and a lot of times people made the assumption that these women were, victims of human trafficking and all of these kinds of things. And I quickly found out that's not the case with any kind of legitimate business that is actually regulated by the US government, right? So these international marriage brokers, they are called, according to the law, which is the International Marriage Broker Regulation Act, which was passed in 2005, right? Which regulates these sites where men pay and women do not pay. So something like a Match.com would not fall under this purview of the law. But these are legitimate businesses, right? And there's no human trafficking of any sort. So then from there, I was just interested, why would women want to do this? Why would men want to do this? And so, kind of, the main finding for why men wanted to do it was they were looking for more traditional women, women who were willing to take on more traditional labor roles in the home, women who were more willing to be feminine in appearance, so thinner, more femininely dressed, makeup, heels, etc. What else were they looking for? They were looking for somebody hot. The younger guys wanted somebody hot, and the older gentlemen kind of wanted someone who would take care of them and take care of the home. So a lot of the guys were looking for someone younger. So many of them had been through divorce, like about 36% of the guys I talked to were divorced already. The median age was about 53. So most of these guys had had a marriage. Some of them had children from previous relationships, but a lot of them were looking for someone younger that they could start a family with or have more children. And a lot of them had felt disappointed with their dating and marriage experiences in the US. And so they wanted to kind of broaden their search. And some of the guys, I think, were adventurous and just wanted to kind of travel and meet a bunch of beautiful women at one time instead of just going on a normal, boring travel package, right? They were like, oh, if I'm going to be paying this amount of money, I might as well be introduced to a bunch of beautiful women while I'm there. So men had, very differing motivations, but in that sense, but most of them wanted someone younger and someone very feminine. And in terms of Colombia, they were looking for women who were more sexy, I guess, is kind of the vibe that Colombian women gave versus women in the Philippines who gave more of a conservative. The guys there were looking more for, I would say, submissive versus sexy. And then in Ukraine, I would say they were looking for a more submissive or traditional looking white woman, right? So race played a big role in Ukraine in the fact that they're white women, but they still have these traditional gender norms in the country. So Ukraine is typically where men start. And most of the time they go there first. And if it doesn't really pan out, which it typically does not, then they would go to places like Colombia or the Philippines or Costa Rica and things like that. So the company I followed, they go to Costa Rica, Peru, Colombia, and they did have a office open for a while in the Dominican Republic and I think they're trying to revive one in Mexico City. So some of that is idiosyncratic in terms of like hiring the right people to start a local office. But I picked Colombia because Colombia was by far the most popular country in Latin America of where men were headed. And then same for the Philippines. It was the most popular country in Asia. So they, once again, idiosyncratic. Their Thailand office was closed, so it's not as popular. And I think for a lot of American guys, the Philippines, the English, right? So it's just such an easy transition, whereas I think more British guys tend to kind of go to Thailand. Anyway, so some of that is also geography. As you pointed out, I'm here in Texas. A lot of the men were from Texas. Like a significant, like 16% of the guys I interviewed were from Texas. So like a significant amount. A lot of guys from Florida as well and California. So the big states. A lot of men who went to Columbia tended to have a Latino background. So some of them spoke Spanish, so they had that kind of advantage over the non-Spanish speaking American guys who go. And so most of the Latin men I would meet on these tours would tend to be going to Columbia. There were Black men who went on tours in all three places. And there were a couple Asian men on tour in Ukraine, but it tended to be mostly white men when I went. And they mostly identified as politically conservative. Most of them were entrepreneurs of some sort or had the kind of more job flexibility where they could take, this week off and travel.
I think that that is interesting. Few things surprise me anymore, but I would say that it's interesting that many of them are conservative. You would think that someone who was politically or socially conservative would be the person most likely to stick to home or most likely to stick to someone who is culturally most similar. Um, you would
You
think
would think
that, but I
so.
case.
Yes, so a lot of these guys think that the local women have been ruined by feminism here in America. So because of that, they think that they will find more submissive and traditional women in these other countries. And for that reason, it's weirdly conservative, but yet not. And they want a conservative woman, but obviously like the type of woman who's willing to marry a foreigner is probably not the most conservative woman of that culture, right? So it's this kind of interesting mishmash sometimes, right? Where the guys are looking for a very conservative woman, and usually the women who are interested in dating foreign guys are more cosmopolitan and educated and looking for more liberal gender roles in the household, right? That's why they kind of are sick of their local options. They're looking for guys who are more open-minded and more financially stable, of course. But
An interesting anecdote. A Russian woman I know who now lives in the United States told me once that, and she's been in the U.S. for many years now, but she told me, she said, this feminism is the dumbest thing ever invented. And that was her perspective. And she literally laughed at, and she had been in the U.S. or in the West long enough. It wasn't like she didn't understand it, but she really didn't want any part of it. And she was from a upper income background in Russia, so it wasn't like she was, from, like looking for someone with money or anything like that. But still, it was interesting that she had that attitude. Now there are different segments, and you have, for example, mail order brides, the old stereotype, even though yes, it was a real thing. And then you have dating platforms. Out there, and there are generic dating platforms. There are things like Tinder. There are dating platforms that are set up specifically for either cross-border or international or ethnically focused markets. And then you have the PID, or premium international dating. How would you differentiate these segments, uh, not just by definition, but by who they are attractive to?
sure, that's a really great question. So I would say when we talked a little briefly about this new passport bro trend and phenomenon. So what is very different in that is that they are not using a agency. They are going there using something like a Tinder, right? And so they're kind of going solo and just using Tinder because it's a lot more affordable. So that demographic skews younger, poorer, and more men of color identify with this whole passport bro phenomenon versus the premium international dating market phenomenon, right? Um, the passport bro situation, I would say people who, once again, are younger, are more likely to use a free platform, right? Um, and are more likely to feel comfortable with online dating platforms than, people who are older. I think people who are older feel much more comfortable with having kind of someone to hold your hand. So the premium international dating market is for those guys who are not very well traveled, who are older, who are not super tech savvy, who want a lot of hand holding, who want vetting, right? They want the women to somewhat be vetted that, yes, this is a real woman, and yes, she exists in real life, and this is not a scam. And there's at least some sort of vetting of that woman that happens in the premium international dating. Like someone had to meet her to put her on the site in theory, right? Whereas, some of the dangers of the whole passport bro phenomenon is, as I'm sure you've seen, some of them die, right? Because they're targeted for, robbery, right? And sometimes it goes wrong. They're overdosed on scopamine, right? And so for that reason, right, the more cautious, older, better off traveler is more likely to hire an agency, right? Because they want that vetting, they want that hand holding, they want that extra service. Then I would say your intercultural kind of platforms, I would say, attract people probably who are, once again, I would say a more general, broad audience. Like you might attract women too. It might not just be fully men who are interested in that kind of platform, like an ethnic dating kind of platform. There are ones that include men and women, and then there are ones that are like women specific, right? So if we're looking at the women specific ethnic dating platforms, I would say those are the kind of guys who are have a little more money than the guys trying to use Tinder, but aren't necessarily willing to commit to traveling in person to meet the women. And what I found out too when I was studying this industry is that like 90% of the men are just satisfied with online relationships and never go in person to meet these women.
Oh.
Right. So that's a huge number, right, of men who are really content with just doing like an online kind of fantasy relationship. So, in that sense, that's why I was saying, like, with this whole AI, like people falling in love with AI, I'm like, I'm not surprised because people have been falling in love with these bots online now for years on these websites with, okay, yes, there's a picture of a beautiful woman associated with that bot, right? But like now we just don't have the picture anymore. Now it's whatever in your imagination the bot looks like is what the bot looks like to you. But so I think, those kind of guys tend to be much more happy with these kinds of fantasy, just like saying, I have this girlfriend in Ukraine and look at these pictures of her and she's so attractive and et cetera, et cetera. And then they get that emotional work of, feeling better about themselves and they can share things with someone that they're writing and corresponding with, right, through the website. So I think those are the kind of differences between those platforms.
That's interesting. I am surprised by that. I mean, I'm not surprised that it exists, but I'm surprised that there's a a frequency of it. But I guess it could make sense in a lot of cases where let's take somebody who maybe is relatively low income. And even if they might send 100 or 200 bucks to somebody in some far off country, I mean, that wouldn't go far in a place like Colombia, but it would in,
Maybe the
somewhere like
Philippines.
or Nicaragua or even places I've been to in Central Asia, which I doubt very much that there's much online dating in Uzbekistan. I've been there, lovely people, but their culture doesn't strike me as one that would fit with that. But 200 bucks would go a very long way in a place like that. And it's kind of safe in a way for both sides. And the guy might have bad body odor, or one of the things that's interesting, I was thinking about this the other day, you have people who are physically incapacitated. I don't know if we still say
Disabled. Hmm.
or disabled, it changes every 10 years. But you've got situations like that. And then um, same on the women's side, you might have somebody that has a situation where they're tied to an elderly parent or something like that, or even maybe moral ideas that restrict what they, a self-restriction and something like that, and that kind of emotional companionship. Would make sense for people. That's really interesting. Now we talk about the types of men who um, are attracted to these services, but it takes women as well. And uh, I would be very curious as to what types of women would sign up. And I would imagine, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I would imagine that there are women who are kind of just curious and might sign up for a dating site even to meet somebody locally, even though there might be foreign people on it. And it's like, well, this guy is foreign. I'll go out with him. I wasn't really looking for that. But then with the premium international dating services and things like that, there are people who specifically look for that. And it's not necessarily the whole stereotype gold digger. I think of a personal friend of mine from Bogota, and she was financially stable on her own. And I just remember she was a very kind of a feminist, forward-thinking person. But she said one time, and I think she was just upset with somebody. She was like, "I'm not dating any more of these local men." And so I thought she was just playing, but she went off and married her a dentist, and now she's in Arizona. But what is the profile of the type of women who, let's say, is on, and I know it's almost unfair to stereotype because you have all different types of people, but I'm trying to imagine a woman saying, I'm going to sign up for this dating service, and then I'm going to go to this party, and there's going to be these foreign men, and the whole purpose of going to the party is to meet a foreign man, versus I'm going to go out and party with the girls, and I met a cute guy while I'm out at the club or something like that. I have difficulty imagining that. So how does that work?
So, a lot of the women are obviously younger than the men, younger than 40. So, at least the main agency I followed, they have like the local agencies have to send somebody's information and photos if they are over 40 to even sign up for the site. So, most of the women are pretty young. They tend to be in their 20s, more mid to late 20s, early 30s. Some of them are single moms, right? So they have kids from previous relationships, also that didn't work out. Some of them are divorced, particularly in Ukraine. Divorce is pretty common. Um, the economic situation varies for a lot of the women. So in the Philippines, I definitely met women who were in some pretty rough economic positions. I met women in Colombia who were middle of the road or kind of rough I mean, you don't meet super wealthy women typically, let's just be honest. Super wealthy women aren't necessarily looking for a foreign guy. Um, Most of the women though, they like wanted somebody stable. That was kind of the main thing, and someone who wasn't going to cheat. So they looked at Western men as less likely to cheat and to be kind of more respectful to their wives in terms of that kind of stuff. And are less, they thought, yeah, Western men would be more faithful and much more stable and family oriented than like local Colombian men.
Interesting, interesting. Um, so how do these like agencies, I mean, do they place advertisements, or do they have like fixers, or how do they go out and I guess recruit? Like I would imagine back in or maybe still you see an ad in the paper and it's like meet foreign guys or find a husband, or I don't know. What do they do?
So they do a lot of radio advertising, word of mouth advertising, and then they often offer a free photo shoot as kind of like the inducement for people to kind of come and check out the office, get nice headshots, and then they can use them for the site. And then the women are happy because they have these beautiful pictures for themselves, right? So that's kind of typically how they recruit. A lot of it is through word of mouth, though, for sure. I think that is the most successful recruiting tool that they have. So people who've enjoyed their dates or people who've gotten married and had success and found relationships are typically their like biggest advertisement, I guess, would be, yeah, like they're successful couples. And they tend to highlight them a lot. And I know when I was in the Philippines, we had, 2 nights where they were doing these social events. And on one night, they had the successful couple kind of come and tell their story. So.
Interesting. So, um, you know, do you see a difference? I mean, are most of the women um looking for marriage, or are they looking for a sugar daddy? And I guess to be fair, Are the men looking for adventures or are the men looking for wives? Of course, they're going to be some of both, but what seems to predominate?
I mean, if I listen to what people tell me, then most of them are going to say they are being sincere and looking for real relationships and all of those things. If I watch people's behaviors, is that always reflected in their behaviors? Not always, right? So I would see guys tell me, "Oh, I'm looking, for someone closest to my age, something very serious," and then they'd be dating 20-year-olds the whole week, and so it's kind of hard to take them seriously, right? Same
Hmm.
with some of the women. They would be like, I'm just looking for someone stable, I don't care kind of thing, what he looks like or whatever the case might be. Um, I think, to a degree, I think the women probably are more serious in the sense of they're not necessarily, well, it's hard to say that because the men are paying for a service. So you're like, in theory, you should be serious about this if you're paying for this service. But some of them are not. So I think the most successful couples, I will say, recognize that, all relationships involve some sort of exchange, right? And I think, a lot of the men who are recognizing, like, hey, I'm an older guy, I want somebody younger. So the way that I can access that is by providing them with a comfortable life.
Hmm.
Those couples tend to work out a little better, right? Where the man is kind of aware of that this is, and the woman is fine with it too, right? Like they're both understanding that, okay, this guy's maybe not the most attractive guy in the world, but he wants to provide me with a stable and comfortable life. And that is what I think of as real love, right? So for some people, real love might be feeling sexually attracted to someone, and for someone, it might be feeling taken care of by someone. So,
It's going to be interesting. In the US, we now have more women. Women are generally better educated than men when we look at bachelor's and advanced degrees.
yes,
And even though men can still maybe earn a lucrative income in things like skilled trades, when if women, and I believe the term, you're the sociologist, but I believe it's hypergamy, where
yeah.
people and so I wonder if we're going to see more social upheaval. I don't mean like riots or things like that, but I mean like in terms of couple dynamics as women end up, I mean, now they're already kind of leveling with status with men. And like you said, some people that look for traditional wives or housewives or somebody to look up to them, like, they may feel challenged. And or you have this, you're not the boss of me. Nothing, nothing wrong with that. I mean, I have a 23-year-old daughter. I teach her to be independent and everything like that, but it's interesting because you travel to other countries. Like I mentioned, my Russian friend who thought, who found feminism kind of bewildering. Uh, you travel to other places, and it's not as, yes, I want feminism. Like you can't, abuse me or beat me on the head. And if I do want to go and get a job, I should be able to. But and I don't know, I'm not a sociologist, but I'm sure that there are people talking about this first wave and second wave feminism and all. I don't, my eyes glaze over. But not that I don't respect it. I don't want to get any bad comments. But the thing is that it's interesting because I wonder what that's going to do when the women are all the professionals or overwhelmingly, and we are already seeing it where you have men that are highly educated and let's say highly compensated in the US, and all of a sudden they find themselves with the experience of a 24-year-old, to use your word, hot woman, in the US, just domestically, where it's like, why do I have to settle down when we women are throwing themselves at me like I'm, with George Clooney or something like that. And it's interesting because I wonder if that will actually drive um, a growth in this industry? And what's your view, having studied that and being an American, being in the US and seeing this phenomenon that we're going through as a highly educated woman, too, not just as a professional? How is this going to affect things?
I think it is going to affect things in a lot of ways. I see a lot more women in their 40s choosing to stay single in the
Mhm.
US, right? Because they feel like the men aren't on par with them in the dating market, which then I think also, right, you as you point out, pushes men further into these kinds of dating markets as women opt out here and they're not, willing to perform these traditional gender roles. So I think, a lot of people talk about this male loneliness epidemic. I don't know
Mhm.
if you've heard that term tossed around. And I think it has to do with men feeling like they can't really access a lot of women anymore because women have surpassed them economically in many ways, right? So the way I kind of think about it is, women used to be men's slaves like 70 years ago, essentially, right? Like you kind of were, like you didn't really have legal rights outside of marriage, and you had to do this labor for men. And so men are kind of expecting that kind of labor from women. And now that more and more women are working outside of the home, they're like, I'm tired. I can't do both things, right? Because our system was set up for it to be one earner and someone at the house taking care of that one earner. And now we have two dual earners. And we're seeing the strains, I think, in intimate relationships. And that's why I also think that this industry is growing in popularity because these strains have been kind of happening in heterosexual intimate relationships in Western countries, not just the US, right? This is also happening in Europe and Australia, Canada, right? So a lot of those guys are also interested in this industry. It's not just Americans, right? So.
Yeah, I think even um, there's a big domestic industry living down here in South America. You see plenty of Latino, of course, duh, mostly that's what most of the people are. But just local domestic people dating and using apps or electronic things, or then in some cultures you have, I forget the word for it. I know that in Jewish culture there's a word for like the matchmaker, and it's like a formal thing, you know. Um, and even somebody on our team, on our company team, is in Asia, in a part of Asia where she's conflicted because her mother is ready to marry her off, and her mother feels like it's her duty to marry her off, and she's a bad mother if she doesn't find a husband. But then the younger generation is more globalized, and she's not so on board with that. Like, you're going to just go find me a husband, and I'm not going to have any say in the matter. And so I don't know what the latest update is on that, but we see a social turbulence again, not just in America, but really, I mean, in Latin America, Colombia, which is generally a conservative country, and most of Latin America is conservative. Abortion is now legal.
Right,
It is now safe to be gay in Colombia. There are
right,
still places like, probably Jamaica, most of Africa, where it's not safe at all. Now in
right,
Colombia, there's still violent gay people and things like that, but it's like it's not like, you can't walk down the street and be gay, and something's probably not gonna. They have parades and events, and the
right,
politicians all come out and speak to it and things like that. So there is a lot of social turbulence happening, uh, for so many different aspects. Now, before we talk, I'm really interested in drilling down on Colombia, but before we do, uh, most of your studies have been in Ukraine, the Philippines, and Colombia. But maybe, do you have any observations from other places that where you've seen a little bit, like maybe China, Thailand, Vietnam, Argentina. What have you seen before we really drill down in Colombia? I'm interested into the differences you've seen in places like in Southeast Asia, outside of the Ukraine, when we think about the Black Sea countries and places like Romania has a certain is known as a destination, I think, for dating, and I think it's a testament. They have very attractive women, as does the Ukraine and things like that. But before we drill down in Colombia, what have you seen in some of the places outside of those big three that you focused on?
So what I see is Thailand tends to be dominated more by Brits. Americans tend to prefer to go to the Philippines because of the language stuff. Um, Vietnam, I think, tends to be dominated more by South Koreans and Chinese. So inter-Asian marriage tourists.
Okay.
Then I would say there's some people who go to Belarus, but that's pretty hard. It's such a closed off country. I haven't heard too much about Moldova or, Central Asian countries. I think they're just a little too far off the beaten path for most Americans. There just aren't enough flights. It's long, it's difficult. Um, yeah, so I haven't heard too much. The company I follow does still do some stuff in Russia, but no organized tours. So they'll take you if you want to go and you'll pay them to take you. But they themselves don't have any like group tours anymore in Russia, but they used to. But like once again, Russia requires a visa. It's complicated, it's a farther trip. And now Ukraine, they also are not doing group tours because of the war.
Mhm.
But they will take individuals who want to go. So they will get you a bus ride into Ukraine because you can't fly there from like Poland or whatever. And you can work with like local office, Ukrainian workers on the ground there. But they are, they've suspended group tours for the interim moment. Costa Rica, a lot of the guys complain that at least the people who ran the office there were disorganized. So I don't know if um but I feel like men had lesser preferences for women in Peru or Costa Rica because of the more indigenous appearance of women, I would say. I would say they were looking more for a stereotypical Latina look, so more Colombian or Brazilian or Dominican. The Dominican Republic, I'm not, once again, idiosyncratic, not sure why that office didn't work for them, but they still do have a lot of women's profiles from the DR on their website. So once again, I think if you were an individual and you're like, I want to do a package to DR, they would make it happen for you. Um, I think a lot of these places are also concurrent sex tour places, right? So I think there's that undercurrent as well, that places associated with sex with beautiful women, right, are just more likely to be chosen as these places. So I think for people in the US, like Central Asian women aren't that known, right? Like people aren't going to be like, oh, Georgian women, right? I mean, we might think they're beautiful, but most Americans aren't even going to know that Georgia is a country, not a state.
Right.
You,
Yeah.
you, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Oh, I
so
mean, like I think about Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, and I've got friends from both places, and I've been to Uzbekistan multiple times. And that's not a place. They're very friendly people, lovely place. They are secular. You can walk around and and you're not going to see somebody in a Brazilian thong or anything like that, but it is a Muslim country, and I mean they have alcohol and they have bars and things like that, but it's not. I'm pretty sure that you would be in a lot of trouble very quickly with anything that got remotely close to like a sex tourism or something like that. Um, they have it's secular, but there is a conservative culture. I would imagine I've been to Turkey, but I don't know anything socially about Turkey. I would imagine something like that too. There's less of a going to be less of an you're going to have like two extremes. You're going to have prostitutes, and then you're going to have like people who are saints and pretend like they're saints, and there's not going to be much in between. Colombia, interestingly, uh, it seemed like after the pandemic there was a big boom in tourism generally, as Colombia got a reputation for being safer. What in your studies did you find make Colombia unique and different from the other destinations for international dating?
So, what was really interesting is that I think, often is a place that men would actually fall in love with. A lot of people would go there and be super impressed by the city life, right? So I was in Medellin mostly, and people really liked how organized it was, red brick buildings, everything looked, clean, modern, up to date. They have this, metro. And so a lot of the guys would talk actually about moving there. So a lot of guys were like, or spending a significant amount of time there if they did get married to someone. And I think for a lot of men, the geographic closeness of Colombia also was definitely a big bonus. Flying to the Philippines or anywhere in Asia is very costly, very time consuming. It's a hard journey. Even flying to Europe, right? Same thing. Um, you're having to cross ocean. So here, and then, the guys, when they went to the Philippines, at least where I was in the Philippines, so I was in Davao, which is in the south in Mindanao. And it's a bit more developing than, I would say, Colombia, right? Colombia is much more developed. And so a lot of the guys felt like it was a little too underdeveloped for their comfort, perhaps. They mostly hung out at the hotel, right? They didn't really go out of the hotel much, whereas I think a lot of the guys in Colombia really enjoy exploring outside of the hotel. So they would go to places like Guatapé and all of these different sites in Colombia. And then in Ukraine, I think they were just kind of like, another European city with some museums and whatever. But they didn't, I mean, guys would move there. I mean, guys, don't get me wrong, guys would want to move to the Philippines for the cheap cost of living. And if you are a vet, like a veteran of the military, the Philippines has the like added advantage of having like veteran affairs offices there and things. And some guys talked about moving to Ukraine, but I felt like most of the men really, really liked Colombia. And I think they were surprised at the first time they came because I think Colombia has this really negative image going back to the 90s, the whole Pablo Escobar stuff. And I think, it has done a lot to change that reputation in its tourism promotions and all of these things. And I think the increased amounts of safety, and especially Medellin is now has become this popular tourist location, in Cartagena as well. And I think, you know, like I said, a lot of it has this overlap with sexual tourism as well, right? So, but I think the natural beauty and then the level of development in Colombia really attracted a lot of the guys, because in Colombia you have mountains, you have beaches, whatever, you have rainforests, you have all these natural kind of things to go see. And so it felt more adventurous. And then I think also some of the guys kind of, because of Colombia's reputation in the past, and that a lot of people still mistakenly believe, they kind of felt like badasses. They're like, yeah, I go to Colombia. I'm not worried about getting kidnapped. Like, it's all good. You're tripping. So, like, it kind of gave them that boost of, feeling kind of like brave and kind of like, going in this intimate frontier, this frontier where, most Americans are scared to go because of all these, narratives about drug trafficking and things. And so, I think, and when I went in 2010, there were less guys than I would say now, right? I think Colombia has become increasingly popular since I've been going and more
Absolutely.
well known. Maybe, part of the thing is the show Narcos, right? Highlighting Medellin and like all of these, different things bringing more light to Colombia. But, um, yeah, I think that's kind of, like men felt more kind of like brave and I think Colombia also was more attractive for guys who kind of wanted to party, right? Like it has more of a party vibe than the other two places, right? The Philippines is a little bit conservative society. Ukraine also, there was a party vibe at the parties that the agency would throw for the guys to meet women. And there's, nightclub life and everything, but I think there was this bigger association with partying because of, once again, drug undertone that kind of characterized Colombia's past. And I want to keep saying Colombia's past because I don't want people to assume that that is true in the contemporary era. So.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. If you were down in 2010, my first time in Colombia was in 2004, and there was pretty much no tourism at the
Especially
time.
back then, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you still had U.S. contractors being held by the FARC in the jungle back my first time down, and I came down. It wasn't for work, but actually, I had a personal friend um, who was actually Cuban, but he had lived in the U.S. previously, and he had been living in Colombia and kept bugging me to come see him. And so my first time was just to visit a friend. Um, and but since things have really become safer after the Uribe administration and through the Santos administration, and then the government has made tourism a key strategy for growth and investment. You start to see, um, big hotel chains and things like that coming down and direct flights into places like I mean there have been direct flights into places like Cartagena for years, but with that
Armenia. Yeah,
yeah,
like, like smaller cities. Yeah. Mhm.
and Manizales and places like that. Manizales, when the volcano was acting up, they keep closing the airport because the volcano keeps burping. You know, but what happens on a romance tour? I mean, uh, you know, I don't know. I've heard about them, and I've always kind of like tried to picture. Okay, there's this group of people, and I mean, basically, what happens? How are these things formatted? And I mean, do they like is the group together in the U.S. or whatever the origin country is, then they all fly down as a group, or do they kind of fly down as they're on their own? And is there like a, a babysitter or a minder that kind of, okay, guys, we're going to get on the bus and go over here? Or I mean, it blows my mind. I've always kind of tried to picture what it's like, and so what is it like? What's the format?
So, the tours there's two different formats. One that they follow in Ukraine because they will often do multi-city tours in Ukraine, which I will talk about separately at the end. But in
Okay.
places like Colombia or the Philippines, where they're concentrated in one city for the entire time, typically the tour setup is you book your own flight. So the cost for the AFA tour does not include the flight. So you are in charge of booking your own flight. I think for Ukraine, they might have a flight leaving from the East Coast that they are all kind of trying to be on, but you got to get to that flight. Okay. So you book your own flight, but then once you get there, right, they pick you up from the airport. They put all the men into one hotel, right? Typically in Medellin, it would be in Poblado area, right? And so the first day they kind of have like an introductory seminar, like, hey, we're gonna kind of show you where the local office is, where the local employees are. So if you have questions or need things, they take them to the local office. They kind of give them a tour about where they can get money and exchange money, basic kind of travel stuff. And then, so that's typically on a Thursday. And so they kind of get the guys in and kind of like comfortable. And then the Friday and Saturday night, they will typically have what they call social parties. And so they will invite much more women than the men. So if, they're trying to, I think, probably have, at least 2 to 5 times the amount of women to the men.
Okay.
And so it's kind of set up in a speed dating format, but with multiple women at one table, and then the men moving from table to table to table in order to meet all the women that are in the room, right? And typically the guy will be assigned a translator for the weekend, right? And so the translator is kind of their note taker. If they're interested in someone, they'll get that person's information. And then at at the end of the speed dating component of the evening, they'll serve food, right? And so the guy will sit at one of these tables, at the last table he is at, and eat food with the women. And then they serve alcohol and drinks in Colombia, and then it's kind of dancing, right? And like a fun party environment. And at that point, I think a lot of women leave if they haven't met any of the guys that are interesting, or if none of the guys have shown interest in them. Some of the women at that point will leave, right? And be like, okay, this wasn't a successful night for me. And then sometimes a lot of the guys will try to take the women out after, right? So the social event ends at like 11 p.m. And then they'll be like, hey, would you like to continue the night if it's someone that they're connecting with? And they'll go to another, bar or nightclub in the nearby, like Poblado area. Back in the day, back when I used to go, it was this place that was very well known for gringos, where they had like midgets and things. Yeah, I forget what it was called, but it was this place. And it was very much directed towards, tourists and things.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. But yeah, they would often go there sometimes after. And so they would do that on both Friday and Saturday night. So now, usually guys typically meet a couple women in person and get their information, and they try to set up dates with them during the week after that, right? So usually the tour is a week long. Maybe you do a 2-week tour.
Hmm.
And so you're sticking around after those socials to kind of set up dates, get a vibe, etc. If you didn't meet anyone that tickled your fancy at the socials, then you would go into the local office and you would go through literal binders of profiles of women's profiles, right? And you would write all these women's numbers down, and then the local office girls will call the women and ask, like, hey, would you be interested in going on a date with this guy? Here's who he is, right? And the women can say yes or no. And so then sometimes the guys will just like go through the local agency to set up dates. And that's a service that you could pay for, right? Like if you lived in Colombia and you don't need to go on a tour, right? Like I met guys who like were expats who were living in Colombia who would use the agency's services to set up dates, right? So you could pay to get an individual date set up, like you would pay the agency a certain amount of money to make that introduction for you. And so that's kind of how it typically works. In the Philippines, it's a bit more conservative. They do not serve alcohol. It's very regimented. Because they don't want anyone getting drunk. Whereas in Colombia, they do serve alcohol, and in Ukraine, they do serve alcohol. So, your cultural norms are kind of impacting, some of how the socials are run. And in the Philippines, they tend to have like little more games and like formal interactive kind of ways to connect to people. In Ukraine, because a lot of times they will be doing multiple cities, there is a bus, and we all get on the bus, and they all get on the bus together. And it's usually about a 4-hour bus ride. And you go, and it's a really intensive thing because you would get there, the men typically on a Thursday, the socials Friday, then Saturday you have the day to kind of date, and then Sunday morning you're leaving for the next city, and that night there's a new social, and then you have a day to like hang out, date, and then the next morning you're leaving for another town and another
Wow.
social. Yeah, uh-huh. And then you're there for another day, and then we're going back to Kiev where we started, right? So at some points guys will drop out, but if you drop out of the tour, then you are responsible for your own transportation and accommodation costs because you've already prepaid the tour
Right.
stuff. And so if you decide to leave the tour, then you're on your own in terms of getting back to Kiev. If you decide to stay in one of these other cities, right? You meet someone and you're like, I want to invest the rest of my time with this individual here in this other city, right? And which does happen quite frequently on those tours. So that kind of gives you an idea of how, and what's interesting too is in Ukraine, they're typically at nightclubs, not in this very like formal sit down speed dating setting that are in the other countries. And they kind of give the guys champagne, and then the guys are kind of left to their own devices to go introduce themselves to women, which can be difficult for some of the more, introverted folks. So.
Right. I would imagine that. Oh, and I don't know, correct me if this is just a stereotype, but I would imagine that a lot of the people on the tours would be those that are kind of shy and like having some hand holding, aside from the language issue, but like uh, who aren't as good at kind of going out on their own or approaching somebody or I guess the slang is to have game, as they would say.
Right, yeah. So a lot of these guys probably don't have a lot of game, who are younger, maybe. There were definitely, quiet guys, but I think there are also a lot of guys who are, like I said, just more looking for those traditional gender roles. So it's not because they can't approach a woman, right, that they're having issues. They just aren't finding the kind of women they would like in the US, and they think they might be able to find that kind of woman in a place like Colombia, let's say. And because of that, I think, there are degrees of hand holding that goes on in this industry, right? So there are like we were talking about before, that this industry caters more to people who need more hand holding, right? People who aren't experienced travelers. A lot of the guys I met, they were like, "Oh, this is my first time out of the US," right? This was their first international trip. They got a passport for this trip. I mean, they thought about it for years before they booked it. Like, it wasn't a light undertaking for a lot of them. And so for that reason, there is that hand holding of having the translator, having someone come and pick you up from the airport, having someone set your accommodations. Like, none of that has to be worried about. But I do think there are some men, and I did talk to them, and I see this more and more as I go, like as time has gone on through the industry, that there are more and more men who are willing to pay more money for more personalized services, more hand-holding kind of stuff, right? Um, and so they want to be, because ASA is not a matchmaking service, right? They aren't intaking your interests, intaking a woman's interest, and then matching you based on like-mindedness, right?
Mhm.
Um, it is an introduction service, right? They're like, we are here, we are facilitating an introduction, and where it goes from there, we don't know, right? And we're not going to claim to know. We're not going to say that this person is your best match. We don't know. But we will introduce you to a bunch of lovely ladies, right? That's kind of the difference. In Ukraine, there were actual matchmakers that I did interview, right? Where it is a smaller agency. You have one or two matchmakers, right? And they are working much more individualized hand-holding with clients, right? Who are willing to pay more for that kind of individualized matchmaking special kind of attention, right? Like they're not leaving you to the wolves. Like they're going to hold your hand and be like, okay, I've made this date with this woman because she has this interest and so do you. And I made this, and taking into consideration, all your different concerns. So that does exist for sure, but it also has a cost premium, let's say.
I've seen just in the airline magazines, I typically fly a lot, and there are these full page ads, and um, I used to roll my
It's
eyes
just
and
lunch.
years after, yeah, that's one. And then there's another one. I've seen a couple of these women who put themselves, I mean, they're praying for these full-time, full-page ads, so they must be doing something. And they're like, we're, millionaire matchmakers, and you don't have the time. And I used to just be in kind of a regular guy, just would look at that and think, what a weird concept. But then I was listening to actually a psychologist that I follow, in Teraband, and he was talking about how if you are, extremely wealthy, then it's like if you're a guy, it's like being an extremely beautiful woman. You don't like a guy, so you're gonna, how much does it cost you? What's the real cost for, let's say if you're like a sports star or a business super guy or something like that? There's a problem in that, like if you're famous, you're gonna have fans. And that's probably not a good way to meet somebody. It's probably not going to end well, because the dynamic is so skewed that
Right.
it's going to be hard to overcome that. And so if you're very wealthy or something like that, or whatever situation you find yourself in, maybe you're famous or something like, I don't, whatever, or like a politician or something like that. Or I have friends who have been in intelligence and they're not allowed to go and do things like, I'm going to just go and date somebody over here. Well, it's almost like if you're serious about the person, they've got to be vetted, in certain countries, to avoid honey traps. And
So once again,
so it's
this
like,
vetting is important, right?
yeah, yeah. And so it's interesting because it seems like there is a place for those types of services. And we see the world as we are, not as it is. And so if you come from if I come from a regular background, I mean, not poor but not rich, and it's like, you do things the regular way, you go out there and meet people. But then there are people who either they don't have the time or they can't, and these are legitimate things for people in those circumstances. I've said I've got friends who are very wealthy. And and I've said, it's there, it's kind of like a prison. They can't go out and do regular things. Like, I had a friend went, it was his wife's birthday. We went to Cartagena. We're in the pool. His security guards are there in the pool with us. He was an executive from a big petroleum company. He
Okay.
can't go for a jog, you know.
Right.
I mean, he can,
Right.
but you have to go with him. He
Right.
has no privacy. Plus, it's like a James Bond movie. There's like henchmen walking around 24 hours a day, you know. Um, and I'm like, geez, I mean, I'd love to have that kind of money, but it's kind of like you're in a jail in a way. You go on
Yeah.
a date. If he's married, he would have to have four security guys on the date with him if he were to go on a date.
Right.
So
Yeah, so I think, the vetting and those like more personalized services are utilized by not just shy guys, right? Could be guys who are, wanting to have a bit more vetting, right? And a bit more assurance that these people are legitimate that they're meeting. And there's a lot of reasons why that's a smart plan, right? And I think also, I think people just in general are seeing maybe the more advantageous things that happen with matchmaking, because matchmaking is a long time thing that happens in a lot of cultures, right? So as we talked about, and we've been doing this, let's pick our own partners for, I don't know, 70, 80 years, and we've seen it leads to a lot of divorce. Maybe we're not the best at picking our own partners because we're blinded by, sexual attraction and all of these other factors, where we're maybe not considering does this person align with my values? Are
Right.
we looking to raise children in the same kind of way, right? Are like all of these kinds of things that maybe, you're not focused on because you're just physically attracted to someone, right? And so I think there is an increasing maybe recognition that maybe, especially some of the guys who've maybe been divorced, right? Maybe I'm not the best at picking my own partner. Maybe I need a little guidance, right? Or you could just look at it, I need someone to cut through all the BS of me looking at hundreds of women with a blindness, right? In this like introduction space. Like this person's going to be like, okay, these five women actually are your type and have these characteristics that you're looking for, and that just saves you a lot of time, right? So
Yeah, you're right. There's something to be said. The idea of a romantic marriage, and I've seen, other experts like give talks on this, is a fairly new concept. And I love history and things like that. It's something that, for the most part, did not exist before 150 years ago or so. Um,
I would say
uh,
probably, yeah, yeah, yeah. Companionate marriage. This idea of companionate marriage, that, husband and wife should be companions and get along and be friends and not just look at each other as a means to, a means of like, I think people forget that the household is the first economic unit, right? So the household is how we order labor in society, how we, and right, so a lot of marriages back in the day were these labor property exchanges, right? I'm gonna and on the elite level, political exchanges, right?
Exactly. One of the things I've seen, and I hate to stereotype, but it's it's kind of true to a certain degree. Not everybody, but one of the things that happens in Latin America, and I've got most of, experience in Latin America for, going back to my 20s. Um, and I'm almost 60 now. But one of the
You look
things
great for
that
your age, by the way.
I got a little bit. I'm from Ohio, but I've got some Caribbean blood in me, so I think that helps. Um,
Yes.
I think yeah, my grandfather is from the Bahamas, was from the Bahamas. But one of the things that happens in Latin America and other cultures as well. I was recently in uh, in Kenya, and I met a guy, and he was telling me that his father has four wives,
Oh,
and that's
wow.
still over in,
Nothing.
the places over there, and this was in Nairobi, and the capital city, and so not everywhere in Africa, but in South Africa, I think the last president had two or three wives, and it's still a thing. But in Latin America, what happens? A lot of men, and I've talked to some of these men. These are people I've known socially or and through business. They'll marry somebody who they think will be a good mother and who is also, like you mentioned, socially a social advantage. But they the whole plan all along is to have girlfriends and mistresses and things like that. So, like you mentioned, the marriage, even still in a lot of places, is very much an arrangement. I don't know if it's I'm sure it's a stereotype. I don't know how true it is, but I hear that like the concept is slightly different in Japanese and Chinese households. The marriage is kind of like we're a team. Maybe you're in love, maybe you're not, but it's like we're going to just do this thing together and raise these kids and run a household as almost like a practical matter of like let's get down to work kind of thing, not like this romantic fairy tale kind of thing. And so you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, and I think that with that shift, whew, people have had a hard time. And I was thinking about this. I talk to my students about this a lot. Uh, I think about like, yeah, like feminism and how men are having a hard time with it is a way that, men are used to getting women's labor, right? It's kind of expected, right? That if you get married, there's going to be someone who's going to do your laundry, someone who's going to take care of you, right? Someone who's going to cook for you. I mean, even when I was in the Philippines, now this is the one thing that I would say stands out about the Philippines is that the big age gaps, right? So you would see 20-year-olds with like 70-year-olds walking around the malls in the Philippines, right? And part of that, right, is a lot of these guys are looking for what we call hospice wives. Someone, a hospice wife, right? Like someone to basically care for you as you age and die, right? And you can't afford hospice and, nursing and care here in the US. So you're willing to make this exchange, right? Where you're going to have this young lady take care of you and you're going to leave her your money.
Wow. On the other hand, my wife always teases me if she doesn't think I'm taking care of myself. She's like, "I'm not pushing you around in a wheelchair. You better go out and exercise." So, so maybe it's the opposite. Now, what do we know about how the State Department, if people decide that, hey, I'm going to go and apply for a visa, the U.S. has a really weird system where they have, I think it's called a K visa. At least I know it used to be. I haven't followed that
A1,
stuff.
yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then, so do you show up and, does the US or do the visa people go, how'd you meet? Oh, yeah, we met with I was on the dating trip and things like that. And do we know anything about how these things are looked at by the state? And I don't know if this was part of your studies or things like that, but what tends to happen afterwards and how easy or difficult is it for them to go through the next steps and say, okay, now we're a couple, we're going to go back to the US, whether back to live or to visit or that kind of thing?
So it depends. And if you are wanting to file a fiance visa, which is a K1 visa, or you're filing like a spousal visa, which is a K2 visa, right? So the industry recommends people file a K1 fiance visa because that tends to get processed faster than a spousal visa. So if you are living apart, right, they suggest that you do the K1. The K1, right, gives the person 90 days. This is the whole show. 90-Day Fiance is premised on this visa. Okay. And so they have 90 days to get married. And within that 90 days, if you do get married, right, then the person files an adjustment of status. And if not, then the person has to return to their country. The K2 or the K2 spousal visa takes a lot longer. It takes usually like a year or two. Whereas back in the day, now I don't know about now how processing times are under this administration, but in the past, it was much faster to get a K1. It would be 6 months to a year versus a year to 2 years for a K2. Now, in terms of how they meet and things like that, um, so some guys run into some problems because if you're using a website that the State Department defines kind of as an international marriage broker, but doesn't follow the IMBRA, right? The IMBRA regulations that they passed in 2005, then you can have some problems with the visa. So a foreign affair is IMBRA compliant. So they actually have a service to help guys, right, file this paperwork. So that is another part of using one of these services, right? Is they have these arms to help you with like the legal paperwork and all of that. But because they're IMBRA compliant, you know, you're not going to have problems because of that. But if you're using a site that might be deemed one of these international marriage brokers by the government, you want to make sure that they are IMBRA compliant, because if they're not based on US, they might not be.
Okay, I see. Now, as a sociologist, one of the things that I find fascinating is why is it usually, and this seems to be across cultures and it seems to be across, well, in history, in old days, men would show up and raid and kill all the other men and steal their wives and kids. And, that's kind of like documented in most of history. Unfortunately, it's not like that anymore. But why is it that it's usually the man that goes places? Of course, some women do. So I say usually, you'll see, plenty of women are tourists and they'll go to France and, visit the Louvre, take a picture or something like that. I imagine that they might have romantic flings. You see these romance novels about things like that. But why is it overwhelmingly the man is the foreigner and the woman is staying put? Not always, of course, but it's why is there that imbalance? Is there something about us as a species, or what is it?
I mean, I think just the access to travel really didn't exist for women to travel solo until like the 1980s, right? So
Right.
men have been traveling and conquering and whatnot for centuries. You know, women have had maybe 40 years of the same kind of opportunity of mobility. I think oftentimes too that because women who are traveling are inverting the relationship, right? Because it's the woman who is typically going to be older, have more money. If she's going, let's say, to the Caribbean, right? So the Caribbean is a popular sex tourist spot for women, right? So like a lot of women go to Jamaica, DR as well.
Yeah. You heard of the Sankey Pankies in Dominican Republic, right?
Of course, yes. Thanky
Basically,
pankies,
yeah.
rented dreads, right? There's a whole, you know, in Bahamas too, right? In the Gambia, in Senegal, a lot of European women go to Africa for sex tourism. They go sleep with Maasai warriors in Kenya, right? Um, but right, so typically there's an inversion, right? Because we're used to the man having more money, the man being older, and you know, we kind of think of that as more socially acceptable, more socially the norm. So I think women who engage in this stuff are more likely to engage in kind of sex tourism and not necessarily want to marry these people and bring them back to their home countries, right? I think,
Because of the hypergamy. Am I
yeah,
pronouncing it? Hypergamy. Yeah,
yeah.
because that creates a status imbalance against the women's favor.
Right. So a lot of women don't want to um you know, feel used. But I mean, there are women who do get married, you know, to these younger guys from different places, and you can see it play out on, you know, shows like 90 Day Fiance, where one of their favorite, you know, tropes, I would say, is finding an older, middle-aged, heavyset white woman who is marrying a younger, you know, Muslim guy. And then
Mhm.
right, and it's a disaster, right? But in general, I think most women are not, I don't know if they're necessarily even aware. Maybe some are more aware about their participation, like really, like I'm going to DR to have sex
Right.
versus I'm going to DR on a girls' trip and oh my gosh, I met this, you know, fun guy and now I'm having sex, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
Right. So I think with women, it's a little more fluid and a little more holiday romance, sex tourism. There isn't that same kind of industry because, um, yeah, most women aren't going to want to marry someone who's poor. Right.
Right, right. What about gay people? Is there something like this? Probably not with the same, organizations that you studied, but is this a thing Are there equivalent types of organizations for gay people, and where do they tend to go?
So there are also circuits of gay sex tourism that are concurrent, I would say, with a lot of heterosexual sex tourism. So Colombia, once again, is a popular place for gay sex tourism. So is DR, right? DR is all equal opportunity. Everybody evidently loves to go there for sex tourism, men, women, and gay people. Um, I think gay sex tourism, once again, is a less formalized thing. So sex tourism is less formalized. You're not going to find a legitimate company that's going to be selling sex, right?
Okay.
So like AFA, right? What they're selling is a service of introducing you. There's no guarantee of sex, there's no guarantee of intimacy, there's none of that, right? And so I think with sex tourism, it's a lot more informal, right? Like these are informal markets. I did read about, a sex tour kind of thing in Lebanon for gay guys, but I don't know if it was organized again by like a formal agency or if it was like an informal group of men going together. But it's funny because in 2014, when gay marriage was legalized federally, one of the people I knew from AFA was talking about how they should expand to include gay people because before you couldn't sponsor someone's visa, right? So there was no point in doing a marriage-based kind of
Right.
business around that, right? Because you can't bring people back. But I mean, since 2014, in theory, right, legally, you could be able to bring a gay spouse on a K-1 visa. And they already have the infrastructure in a lot of these countries that would be popular for gay marriage tourism as well, places like Colombia. They never, at least AFA, I never saw jump on it. And now, in 2025, I think they're going to overturn gay marriage. So I don't think it's probably going to become this formalized industry. I think it will remain kind of this informal, um, kind of more sex tour space, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of uncertainty, economically, politically, the legal, social, um, impact of things. If like a brother or a trusted friend were to come to you and say, I'm thinking about exploring this and maybe trying, and I don't want to be brand specific because I know that you know there that you've collaborated and that um uh an agency has helped to enable your research. But let's just say generally across the board, if somebody were to come to you and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about signing up and doing this," what advice would you give the person as to make sure that they, I won't say have a positive experience because there's so many variables, but what should somebody know if they're looking at this, and let's say both from the perspective of the man, and then also let's say locally, if a woman was saying, "Hey, I'm thinking about participating in this. Is it a good opportunity, or what? Not is it a good opportunity, but what should I know?" What would you say from the men's and the women's perspective?
Sure. Like, what are some red flags to avoid, and what you should be looking for in a legitimate company, let's say. So I would
Yeah, and how not?
yeah, how not to get scammed, how not to be taken advantage of. Those are the things. So for the men, I would recommend finding a reputable agency that has customer reviews outside of their website, right? So, you can read genuine customer reviews. There are Reddit pages, that are dedicated to discussing these agencies. There's plenty of information out there. My second major thing would be make sure if you are an American and you want to bring someone to the US, that this agency is IMBRA compliant, because otherwise then you might have problems with paperwork later down the road. Um, I would recommend using an agency if you are not a well-traveled person. If you are not confident about navigating different countries by yourself and navigating these kinds of things, I would recommend using an agency versus trying to go it on your own with Tinder. Just because of safety precautions and all of these things. Like I told you, we've discussed in Colombia, there have been some incidences where people are, getting robbed and things like that. So you have to be really careful. And I would just recommend always, looking at reputable, like who's reputable. Try to read as many reviews as you can. Try to find out if this company is, compliant with the regulations of the US so that you don't have problems, like I said, later down the road. For the women, same. Make sure this place is reputable. Look up, their reviews online. For the women, it's a free service, so they're not going to necessarily lose out much if it doesn't say pan out for them, right? It's not like they're paying for it like the men are. So for the women, they just a lot of them never even have, never go to a social, may never even meet a guy. So it's a hard, my advice to them would be like, keep your expectations realistic. That, like there's so many women on these sites. There's a lot of competition. How are you going to kind of distinguish yourself from the competition? Um, and how do you intend to kind of make yourself available? Like you should be going to the socials and things like that. Otherwise, no one's ever going to see you in person. And if your profile's inactive, you're going to fall, further and further back on the site, and then no one's ever going to see you. So you want to make yourself visible and learn English. Unfortunately, right? But learn some English would be my advice to the women. And my advice for the men too would be learn some of the local language and local customs of where you're intending to go. So in the case of Colombia, we should all know at least a little basic Spanish as Americans, but try to, learn some nice, cute phrases to say in Spanish. And learn the local customs, right? They're different. Like you should be well dressed. You should be bringing flowers, right? If you want the traditional relationship, then you have to behave in that traditional courting manner that we have abandoned in the US, right? We've become very casual about dating. If we look at 1950s American dating, it was very formal, right? Like someone would come, pick you up, have flowers, meet your parents, etc., etc. Think about if that's the kind of relationship you're looking for, then that's the kind of courtship you need to provide.
It's kind of, it cracks me up and makes me cringe. There are like two stereotype tourists. You can spot them a mile away, and you'll see people who come down here, and they either have one of these shorts and these flip flops,
Oh
and
yeah, the
you're like,
cargo shorts.
yeah, and it's like nobody in the country dresses like that. Or you see these guys and they look like they're out of a rap video or something like that. And that's that's fine. It's funny. My wife was complaining. She was like, I was at the mall and these guys were bothering me. I mean, they didn't do anything, awful, but they were like trying to flirt with her and she was just annoyed. And she was like, they look like a bunch of, she calls them yo-yos because she says they look like the people on TV who go yo, yo, yo. And I was dying
Yo-yos. Oh my gosh.
some yo-yos. And that's her name for people who come down here and they've got these big ball caps on, and it's nothing wrong with wearing a ball cap or wearing flip-flops if that's what you want to do. But you kind of, when you're in a different country, you look like a clown. And these people don't have enough self-awareness to know that they look like a clown. And yes, women will talk to you, but they're probably hookers.
Right.
No regular,
Yes.
respectable person is going to do that. Um, they're not going to put up with you. They don't want to be seen with you. And now you've got a book out. You've done research on this for many years now. You've recently published a book. Tell us about your book. the title, and of course, we'll certainly link to it, where it can be found, and who it's for. And it's obviously on this subject, but maybe talk a little bit about your book.
Okay, thanks. So the book is called Economies of Gender, Masculinity, Mail Order Brides, and Women's Labor. So I'm kind of looking at um, this idea of labor and gender as kind of an outcome of the work we do to be recognized as either feminine or masculine, right? So women, like you're saying, your wife spends an hour to get ready just to go to the grocery store. That's a type of work that we
Hmm.
often don't think about, but that is a very important work to being recognized as feminine, right? She wants to be seen as feminine, and that's why she puts that work in, right? And I
Absolutely.
think a lot of the guys feel like they're being denied that kind of work that women used to do in America. And so, as I said, there's this feeling of loss that men have because of feminism, that they say it's, feminism's fault that women are no longer providing this labor willingly or for free. And so for that reason, we often think about the original mail order brides, right? Or frontier brides, as they called them, were about getting women out there to have babies and maintain homes. And women's labor is often invisible, but so important to the functioning of society, I guess, would be kind of what I wanted to kind of highlight with women's labor. And men, I think, kind of define their masculinity in terms of the type of women who they can access and the type of labor that they access from those women. And so I give Donald Trump as a prime example. There's a reason why he married a much younger, much more attractive woman, right? It gives his masculinity a boost to think that other men are jealous of his wife, right? Because she's so beautiful and young and attractive. And there is an exchange there, right? That we all see, right? We know that Melania Trump would have never married Donald Trump if he was Joe Schmo next door with making 50K a year, right? But also Donald Trump would have never married Melania Trump if she was a his age looking woman who was super career oriented and didn't cater to his lifestyle, right? So there's this clear exchange in this relationship. And I think, we often talk about relationships as if they are free of exchange when that is not the case. We like to romanticize our intimate relationships, but all intimate relationships, whether that's a friendship, a business partnership, they all contain some elements of exchange. And just being aware that all of these relationships are we're exchanging, and your femininity has value in a system where femininity is valued in a certain kind of way, right? And so men want, I think, a woman who will do certain kinds of labor to make them look better, right? And then that's a lot what a lot of these guys are looking for, I think.
That's a fascinating concept. I think that relationships can be more successful when there's some awareness of that, and not in a transactional sense. You want it to be a relationship, not a transaction, but to understand that there is an exchange of value. It reminds me, I was talking, this was years ago, but I was talking to an ex-girlfriend, but I was talking to her as a friend years after we had had a relationship. And I remember she was rattling off, and she was saying, I want this and I want that, and this is what I want in a man, and stuff like that. And so I looked at her and I said, in exchange for what?
Mm,
And she both shocked and offended. Not shocked like she got mad at me, but it was very jarring, because she had never thought about this. And we were people who had dated like in our late teen years, and this was a conversation we were probably having um in our late 30s, or maybe if I was around 40. And so, you're not in your 20s anymore,
right.
but you're setting all the standards, and that's absolutely fine. But have you thought about okay, a larger context or a larger strategy of what do I have to offer? As men, we are constantly reminded of that and have to think about that. And a lot of women do think about that. A lot of women don't. And a lot of men, where they mess up is they don't necessarily have an idea of what they want, and think about a woman, and it's like, well, she's attractive or fits my taste or is a good mother, like I mentioned, kind of a stereotype down here. But beyond that, are your trajectories or where you want to go in life, there's a mismatch there, and it goes back to, in some cultures, the families get together and do it, or there are, in other cultures, there are actually professional matchmakers, and they've done it like that for hundreds of years and things like that. And with the modern marriage, I think that, um, now if we're together because we want to be, not because we have to be. Whereas if you got a divorce in your 40s, as a man, it was a career limiting move. And in fact, you wouldn't get promoted if you weren't married, you know,
Right.
uh,
Or
let,
had kids.
let alone women in the workforce, which was something that came about, I think, years of sociology, not me, but around World War II, because of the labor um, things and stuff like that. And so divorces are higher now because you're basically like a super long-term boyfriend and girlfriend. Kids change that dynamic, but there's there's less outside social pressure, pushing you together as befriend. That's probably has both good and bad things to it.
Yeah, and I think as I said, relationships a lot of times are based on more shallow things nowadays, right? Oh, I'm attracted to this person or whatever, and you don't really think about these longer term issues like values, where you want to go in life, all of those things. And people grow apart too, right? Perhaps you started off with the same values, and as time goes on, perhaps those values shift or, the paths shift. I think that's why, sometimes using a professional matchmaker, I don't know, maybe it is better. I didn't use one. Maybe it is better. Who knows, right? Than trying to kind of figure it out on your own. Maybe there is something to, people relying on their parents to help them find a good mate, right? In other cultures. So, but I think that's why we see more and more people kind of turning online though, right? As they're just like looking for more options and to wider that scope, I think, of availability of who's out there. But that also can be like inherently like overwhelming and almost limiting because there's so many options. How do I choose, right?
You've been super generous with your time, and I appreciate it. This has gone into two parts now. Um, Is there anything that you found in your studies that I neglected to ask? I want to make sure that, if there's something that I didn't, that you feel is noteworthy or worth mentioning, that we didn't cover.
Just one final note, I guess, is most of the time, a common question I would get is kind of what happens once people are married. How successful are these relationships? So that is a common question I get. And the last chapter of the book does take a look at some of the successful couples who actually did get married. And so what I've found in terms of that is that most of the successful couples are with the Filipino wives. So Filipino wives, and there have been successful marriages from Ukraine and Colombia, but I'm more like I've seen a lot of divorces in those spaces. Whereas none of the folks I know who got married since like I was in the Philippines in 2012 have gotten a divorce yet. So that gives you an idea of the longevity of some of these relationships. A lot of them have kids since they got married. And so uh, a lot of times people look at the Philippines as, well, I will just say most of the people, when I went on tour in the Philippines, there was 12 engagements by the end of the week.
Oh, wow. Is it that the culture is more conservative? Is it that there's this kind of, you know, stereotype, I would imagine, annoys a lot of uh, Asian women that they're uh, submissive or something like that. I don't know. That to me sounds like kind of a silly stereotype, but maybe it's true. What do you think are the ingredients or the reasons for that?
I think there's a couple things going on. I think, as we were saying, the culture in the Philippines is the most conservative out of all the places I've visited, right? They don't serve alcohol at the socials. It's much more religious and Christian, and divorce is illegal in the Philippines, so it's not very common. So I think there's this, stigma against divorce. I think there is a lot more poverty in the Philippines. So I think people are much more willing to leave their country of origin than women, say, in Colombia. So women in Colombia were like, I want to marry a gringo, but I want him to come here, like I don't want to leave. I love my country, right? Whereas women in the Philippines, especially the ones I met, tended to already be internal migrants, right? So they were already rural to urban migrants. So a lot of them were from provinces. A lot of them were already supporting their natal families, supporting their siblings going to school, sending money to their families already. A lot of them had already worked abroad as OFWs. So the Philippines sends out the largest number of migrant workers all over the world. So I had met quite a few Filipinos who worked in Saudi Arabia, UAE, right, as nurses, as domestic, all sorts of different work. So they were already more open, I think, culturally speaking, to migration, to looking elsewhere for financial and, kinds of stability. So, and I think the Philippines is less developed, so people were more, once again, willing to leave. They saw less opportunities for themselves there in the Philippines. And so for that reason, I think the conservative culture, the familial expectations that you're going to take care of your family once you migrate too, right? Like that you're going to remit money and send it back to your natal family is a huge motivating factor in the Philippines as well, I think. Um, they're the third or fourth largest receiver of remittances after
Yeah.
India, China, and Mexico. So that gives you an idea because Philippines is very small compared to India and China, right? Mexico seems obvious because of all the migrants in the US. So I think that's why those relationships tend to be the most successful.
Interesting. I think also what happens is that with the US, if you come from Colombia to the US, it's the culture is different, but it's not that different. You're going to be around other Latinos wherever you
Ah,
go. You're going to have a certain degree of comfort, which is empowering. And that's, good.
right,
You're going to be less isolated, but then again, you're going to, you don't have to put up with as much crap, to use a technical term.
right.
You need to be as committed, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but if you're from some, rural island in the Philippines archipelago and you're in with somebody in Tucson, Arizona, you probably don't, it's not so easy to say, well, screw you, I'm going to just step out. Whereas if you're from Colombia or Mexico or Dominican Republic, you probably have 12 cousins, maybe somewhere nearby, and it's like I'm not going to put up with this, you know, justified or unjustified, whatever it is. Um, you're 2 hours away. We're a 2 hour flight from the states. And so uh, there's a lot more familiarity and there's a lot more ability to navigate than I would say from somebody from really especially like you mentioned, rural to city in the Philippines, and then with having a culture where people are working in maritime, aboard ships or in different countries or in the Middle East or in places like that, or obviously, the Philippines has done a great job with matriculating nurses into
Mhm.
the U.S., which has been. professional opportunity. Very proud of them there. So, we could go on for hours. I don't want to take up any more of your day. It's been fascinating talking to you. Count on us. Any other research or things that you do, your work is really not just interesting, but important. And also, I would say daring in a sense that it's a topic that to some degree is taboo. It's not like sex work or anything like that, but it's one of these things that people don't necessarily like to talk about always in polite society, let's say.
Yeah, no, 100%. But what I found is it's maybe taboo, but more widespread than one would think. Because whenever I would bring up my research, usually at least one person in the group will be like, "Have an uncle, my dad, my brother, my coworker, a cousin, a friend, right, has had this experience, done this, has a mail order bride, or married someone from abroad." So it's a lot more common than you would think, actually, and it's becoming more and more common and more mainstream, I think, as um, this kind of gender friction is happening in Western countries.
It is, you go in, you see on YouTube now or on Instagram, it's like women of Walmart, and it's like not to pick on, it's not Walmart's fault, but I'll never get where use people who will go into the store in pajamas or slippers, or they've got a bag on their head like they're in the shower or something like that, and you don't see that. And I mean, not even in poor neighborhoods, people will do the best they can. You know, I mean, in the 70s, when I was a kid, uh, they would have thought that something was wrong with you mentally if you would go out like that. And and it's becoming it's interesting because I don't know what the drivers are, societal or whatever that with that, but you are right, is that there is and aside from the equal rights part of feminism, which is obviously a positive development, there is a nostalgia from when men knew how to change oil, and and can know how to, what kind of screw to buy at the hardware store, or can gut a deer or something like that, to now they know how to, call an Uber. And then on the women's side as well, there's been a emasculation of men, but then a masculinization of women, and some people are on board with that. Uh, but and other people are perfectly okay with it, but don't want it for themselves, you
Right.
know. And that's creating a lot of this, I think, to where they say when men were men, now it's like where men are men or where women are women, kind of thing. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Let's definitely keep in touch. Count on our enthusiastic, I don't even know if support is the word, but encouragement.
Thank you.
And you're
I
doing
really
very
appreciate
important
that.
work. So take care.
You too. Thanks, Lauren. Bye.
Uh-huh. Goodbye.